Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of your favorite late-night historical lullaby. Tonight, we're dimming the lamps, fluffing the pillows, and sliding into a topic that Hollywood has done its best to ruin: the Roman gladiators. You know them, muscled dudes in leather skirts, swinging swords, shouting, "Are you not entertained?" Like that's supposed to make sense when you're bleeding out in the sand. But tonight, we're not doing Russell Crowe cosplay. We're doing the slow version, the real version, the fall asleep to the sound of people getting quietly disappointed in Roman society version. So, grab your blanket, maybe pour some chamomile tea, and prepare to hear about how one of the most iconic symbols of Roman culture was basically a mix between a wrestling match, a state-funded distraction, and the ancient world's favorite excuse to watch other people suffer while pretending it was noble. Relax, though. We're not going to be dramatic. This isn't blood-soaked action. It's more like the world's longest history lecture, read in a monotone, with just enough dry sarcasm to keep your brain awake until it finally gives up. So, gladiators. Let's start with a vibe check. Not so heroic beginnings. When you picture gladiators, your brain probably goes straight to heroic men fighting lions in arenas the size of football stadiums. But like most of history, the actual beginning is weird, boring, and a little depressing. The whole concept started not as public entertainment, but as funeral rituals. Because apparently nothing says, "Sorry, Uncle Marcus is dead," like making two random guys stab each other next to the casket. Yup, the earliest gladiatorial contests we know of happened in the 3rd century BCE. They were called munera, which literally means duties or offerings, as in a noble family had the duty of sending off their dead relative with a big bloody party. And instead of singing hymns, they hired slaves or prisoners of war to hack each other up. Because why not honor the dearly departed with a side of carnage? Now, the Romans would tell you this had religious significance. They'd say it was about sacrifice, about showing the seriousness of death, about pleasing the gods. But honestly, it just seems like a very on-brand Roman way of turning grief into a spectator sport. From funerals to Friday night. Of course, Romans being Romans, the whole thing got bigger. Once people realized that, hey, watching two sweaty guys try not to die is kind of entertaining, it started spreading out of funerals into regular festivals. Think of it like when your weird uncle brings karaoke to the family reunion, and next thing you know, someone opens a karaoke bar downtown. By the late Republic, gladiatorial shows were no longer rare or sacred. They were everywhere. Politicians especially loved them. Why? Because hosting games was the ancient version of buying Instagram followers. If you wanted votes, you didn't just kiss babies. You gave the people bread, circuses, and the front row seat to some poor guy getting speared in the kneecap. And boy, did it work. Candidates would bankrupt themselves to put on massive gladiator events, which, if you think about it, is not that different from modern politicians blowing campaign money on fireworks and bad music. Same energy, just more blood. Who were these guys anyway? So who actually became a gladiator? Spoiler, it was not the buff volunteer heroes Hollywood likes to show you. The majority were slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals. Basically, if you were unlucky enough to get captured or unlucky enough to steal bread from the wrong senator, congrats, you might end up in the arena. But here's the twist. Not all gladiators were unwilling. Some men actually volunteered. Yup, free citizens who technically could have had normal lives sometimes signed up to become gladiators. Why? Well, for money, fame, and, okay, mostly money. Also, some of them were just thrill seekers. Romans had a category for these guys called auctorati. They weren't forced, they chose. It was like signing up for extreme sports, but with worse odds of survival. And believe it or not, gladiators were kind of celebrities. People collected little oil lamps with their favorite fighters on them, like action figures. Women wrote love notes to them. And yes, sometimes they actually won freedom if they survived long enough. So, in a strange way, gladiators were stuck between total humiliation and total stardom. It's like being on a reality TV show. You might get rich, you might get famous, or you might get horribly humiliated on live television, or, in this case, live amphitheater. Gladiator schools, the original boot camps. Now, you didn't just throw a random guy into the arena and hope for the best. Gladiators trained. A lot. There were actual gladiator schools, ludi, spread across the Roman Empire. And these schools were intense. Imagine a military boot camp, but run by people who don't care if you cry. Gladiators lived together, trained together, and basically existed as property of their lanista, the trainer, owner, and all-around shady business manager. A lanista was basically the Dana White of Roman Rome, except without the podcast appearances. In these schools, gladiators learned specific fighting styles. There wasn't just one kind of gladiator. There were categories, almost like different video game classes. You had the retiarius, the guy with a net and a trident, looking like a very aggressive fisherman. You had the murmillo, the heavy dude with a big shield and a helmet shaped like a fish, because of course, Romans loved fish jokes. Then there was the secutor, designed to fight the net guy with a smooth helmet so he wouldn't get tangled. It was all very organized, very choreographed, and very absurd when you realize someone actually sat down and designed this. The fights weren't always death matches either. Hollywood makes it seem like every loser got a sword through the neck. In reality, gladiators were valuable. Training them cost a lot of money. So, unless the crowd demanded death, most fights ended when one guy was clearly beaten. Sometimes they were even staged to showcase skill more than brutality. Think WWE, but with slightly higher risk of decapitation. Let's talk about that thumbs down thing. Okay, quick aside. You've definitely seen the classic scene where the emperor gives a thumbs down to signal death. Here's the problem. We don't actually know if that's true. Ancient sources are super vague. Some say thumbs down meant mercy, some say thumbs up meant kill. Basically, no one agrees. So the iconic Caesar thumbs down moment might just be Hollywood nonsense. In reality, the signal was probably more complicated, maybe even just a gesture with a hand covered in a cloth, which is less cinematic, but also way more Roman. Because of course they would make even their kill signals unnecessarily confusing. The fans, Rome's original sports bros. Now, if you thought modern sports fans were rowdy, just imagine 50,000 Romans crammed into the Colosseum after a few cups of cheap wine. People had favorite gladiators like we have favorite teams. They cheer, boo, and even riot if the result wasn't what they wanted. There are stories of emperors having to calm the crowd because fights weren't bloody enough. Basically, the fans were bloodthirsty, drunk, and very vocal. So like soccer fans, but with less singing and more stabbing. And then, of course, there was the betting. Romans loved to gamble on gladiators. Who would win? How long the fight would last? Whether someone would survive. If you've ever seen your uncle scream at a football game because of a lost bet, congrats, you already understand Roman culture. The Colosseum and peak gladiator culture. We can't talk gladiators without mentioning the Colosseum. Built under Emperor Vespasian and finished by his son Titus in 80 CE, it was basically the ultimate flex. A stadium that could hold up to 50,000 people, all there to watch human beings fight for their lives. And the Romans went all out. The Colosseum had trapdoors, underground tunnels, even pulley systems to lift animals into the arena. They staged mock naval battles by flooding the floor. Imagine building the world's biggest entertainment center, then immediately saying, you know what would be fun? Throwing a giraffe in there. The Colosseum was less about fun, but more about politics. Emperors used it to keep the public happy. Free games, free bread, endless distraction. Don't worry about the empire falling apart. Look, we've got zebras fighting gladiators. It was the ultimate propaganda tool. And that's where we'll pause for tonight's opening stretch. We've gone from funeral fights to the Colosseum, from sad slaves to minor celebrities, from fish-shaped helmets to drunk Roman fans. Next time, we'll drift further into the quirks, scandals, and tragic stories of real. Part 2. Famous faces, weird emperors, and the awkward glory of gladiators. All right, welcome back. You're still here, which means either you're genuinely interested in ancient Rome or you're too cozy under the blanket to bother reaching for the pause button. Either way, good news. We're only just warming up. Last time, we left things at the Colosseum, the Roman Empire's biggest, bloodiest stage. Now, let's drift into some of the actual people involved, because as entertaining as anonymous man with trident may sound, the Romans really loved their celebrity culture, and gladiators, much like modern athletes or reality TV stars, were sometimes embarrassingly famous. Gladiators as ancient celebrities. Let's be clear, gladiators were not respectable. They were slaves, criminals, or desperate volunteers. Roman elites looked down on them in theory, but in practice, the hypocrisy was strong. Because the same senators who sneered at gladiators in speeches were also hosting them at dinner parties, sneaking them into private bedrooms, and writing terrible poetry about them. Women in particular were enthusiastic fans. There are actual graffiti from Pompeii where women bragged about their favorite gladiators. One famous scribble calls a gladiator the delight of the girls, and another describes one as the heartthrob of all the maidens, which is a polite way of saying he probably got more love letters than he knew what to do with. And yes, affairs happened. High-born Roman ladies sometimes had scandalous relationships with gladiators. This was especially humiliating for their elite husbands because being cheated on was one thing, but being cheated on with a sweaty guy who lived in a barracks and fought with a net, that was social death. So gladiators existed in this bizarre space, despised in official culture, adored in popular culture, which honestly sounds very familiar if you've ever seen tabloids. Real named gladiators. Most gladiators are anonymous to us now, but a few became so famous that their names survived. Take Spiculus, for example. He was a favorite of Emperor Nero, and by favorite, I mean Nero lavished him with wealth, houses, and, because it's Nero, probably weird dinner invitations. Spiculus was so beloved that when Nero decided to kill himself, he reportedly asked for Spiculus to do the honors. Unfortunately for Nero, Spiculus wasn't available, so the emperor had to improvise, which is honestly a very Nero thing to happen. Another famous one was Flamma, a Syrian-born gladiator. He was awarded the Wooden Sword of Freedom not once, not twice, but 4 times. And every single time, he turned it down. He chose to stay in the arena. Why? Maybe he loved the glory. Maybe he just didn't want to go back to normal life. Or maybe he had realized that once you've been cheered on by 50,000 drunk Romans, farming cabbages just doesn't cut it anymore. And then there's Carpophorus, an animal fighter who reportedly killed 20 beasts in a single day. Lions, bears, leopards, you name it. The man basically lived in a constant episode of Animal Planet, only with way more teeth involved. The emperors who played gladiator. Now, let's float to the top of the social food chain, because some emperors weren't content to just watch the games. No, some of them decided they wanted to play, which went about as awkwardly as you'd expect. The most infamous was Commodus, yes, the villain from Gladiator. In real life, he was somehow even stranger. Commodus loved fighting in the arena. He would show up, dressed in shiny armor, and compete against gladiators. Of course, none of them were actually allowed to hurt him. The fights were staged, the odds stacked, and yet Commodus insisted on presenting himself as the greatest warrior alive. He also liked to kill animals in the arena, which sounds tough until you realize most of them were tied up or already half dead. He once bragged about killing 100 lions in a single day, which sounds impressive until you realize that's like shooting fish in a barrel, if the fish are exhausted and chained down. The Roman public, meanwhile, pretended to cheer while quietly rolling their eyes, because when your emperor insists on cosplaying as a gladiator, you don't boo, you clap politely and hope he doesn't decide to execute you later. Women gladiators. Oh yes, this was a thing. The Romans called them gladiatrices. And before you get too excited, no, there wasn't an all-female league. But occasionally, women did fight in the arena. Sometimes as a novelty act, sometimes as genuine performers. Roman writers were scandalized, of course. To them, women fighting was shocking, unnatural, and there's no polite way to put this, arousing in ways they were too repressed to admit. The satirist Juvenal complained about high-born women who trained with swords and bruised themselves in practice. Which means, yes, there were probably patrician daughters sneaking off to gladiator gyms. Eventually, emperors banned female gladiators. The official excuse was dignity. The real reason was probably that senators' wives were having way too much fun. Daily life of a gladiator. So, what was it actually like, day to day, being a gladiator? Surprisingly, not as bad as you might think. I mean, still bad, but not as bad. Gladiators were valuable investments, so they weren't starved or casually whipped to death. They were fed a special diet, lots of barley, beans, and carbs. Archaeologists even call them the barley men. Think of it like the ancient version of bulking season. Less protein, more porridge. They trained constantly, and they lived under strict discipline. But compared to common slaves working in mines or fields, gladiators had slightly better conditions. They had medical care, they had the possibility of fame, and as we've said, they had fans. Of course, the downside was, occasionally having to fight for your life in front of 50,000 screaming people. But hey, free room and board. Were the fights really to the death? This is the big question. Hollywood says yes. History says not always. Gladiators were expensive. Training them took time and money. Killing them off every match would have been financially stupid. So most fights probably ended before death. A beaten gladiator could signal surrender, and then it was up to the sponsor or the emperor to decide his fate. Did people die? Absolutely. Sometimes dramatically. But the every fight to the death thing is an exaggeration. Most were brutal, bloody, and exhausting, but not necessarily fatal. Which, in a way, makes it even weirder that the Romans saw this as entertainment. Imagine going to see a boxing match, except instead of scoring points, one guy is stabbing at another guy with a trident until the referee shrugs. The decline of gladiator games. Eventually, the whole system started to fade. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Roman Empire was changing. Christianity was spreading, emperors were broke, and honestly, people were getting tired of the whole let's watch people fight to the death thing. Christian leaders criticized the games as immoral, and while Rome wasn't exactly quick to listen to moral arguments, the financial ones hit harder. Keeping up massive gladiator schools, expensive shows, exotic animals, and massive arenas was just too much. By the early 400s CE, gladiatorial combat had more or less fizzled out. The Colosseum would keep hosting events, but not the kind of bloody shows that once made it famous. The age of the gladiators was over. And that, my friends, is the gentle glide through part 2. We've met famous fighters, ridiculous emperors, scandalous women, and the barley diet nobody asked for. Next time, we'll drift into the myth versus reality section. We'll unravel what Hollywood got hilariously wrong, what Romans actually believed about the games, and maybe even float into the weirder side notes, like exotic animals, wild festivals, and why Romans thought throwing a giraffe into a stadium was a good idea. For now, breathe out. Imagine Commodus pretending to be a hero while stabbing tied-up lions, and let the calm absurdity of history carry you off to sleep. Part 3. Myths, exotic animals, and Rome's weird idea of fun. Welcome back. Still awake? Maybe. Or maybe your eyes are already half closed and you're drifting in and out of consciousness while I explain why Romans thought nets and tridents were a respectable career path. Either way, let's keep going. We've already covered gladiators themselves, their celebrity status, and emperors who cosplayed as warriors. Now it's time to look at the myths versus the reality. Because honestly, most of what people know about gladiators comes from movies, and movies are about as reliable as a drunk Roman senator promising tax reform. Myth 1. Every gladiator died horribly in the arena. Let's start with the big one. Hollywood loves the idea that every match ended in blood, guts, and a tragic slow-motion death scene. The truth is, as we've said before, no, most gladiators didn't die every time they fought. If they had, the schools would have gone bankrupt within a week. Archaeological evidence suggests that the average gladiator's career included dozens of fights, not just one. Some even lived long enough to retire. Not exactly safe, but definitely not the meat grinder Hollywood shows. So, next time you see a movie where every fight ends with someone screaming dramatically, remember, the Romans were cheap. They weren't about to throw away a good investment just for the drama. Myth 2. Gladiators were always slaves. Mostly true, but not always. Remember the octorati? Those free men who signed up voluntarily, usually because they were broke or addicted to danger? Yeah, they existed. And in some rare cases, even elites dabbled in the games. It was scandalous, of course, but Rome loved scandal, so naturally, it happened. Picture your local governor quitting his job to join a WWE tour, and you get the idea. Myth 3. Thumbs down meant kill him. Ah, yes, the most famous myth, that dramatic moment when the emperor turns his thumb down and the crowd gasps. Except the actual Roman gesture is a mystery. Thumbs down might have meant mercy. Thumbs up might have meant kill. Some scholars argue it wasn't even about thumbs, but more like waving your hand. So basically, Hollywood took a vague Latin description and turned it into meme-worthy hand signals, which is fine, but don't count on it being historically accurate. So next time you're tempted to give a thumbs down in traffic, just remember, you might actually be saying I forgive you. Myth 4. Gladiators were loved by all Romans. Not exactly. The masses adored them, but Roman elites saw them as disgusting. Philosophers like Seneca wrote about how degrading it was to watch men reduced to animals in the arena. He wasn't wrong, but then again, he also admitted that sometimes he stayed to watch anyway, because, entertainment. So, gladiators lived in this weird double reality. adored by the public, despised by the elites, and constantly trapped between celebrity and shame. Honestly, they were the ancient version of pop stars. Exotic animals, because humans weren't enough. Now let's talk about the animals, because apparently watching people fight wasn't exciting enough. Romans also needed lions, leopards, elephants, crocodiles, giraffes, rhinos, and occasionally hippos. These events were called venatones, beast hunts. Specially trained gladiators called bestiarii fought animals in the arena. Sometimes it was staged as a hunt, sometimes as a slaughter. Either way, the animals usually lost. And where did these animals come from? All over the empire. Lions from North Africa, tigers from the east, elephants from India. Rome basically turned the Colosseum into the world's deadliest zoo. There's even a story about Emperor Titus opening the Colosseum with 5,000 animals killed in a single day, which sounds impressive, until you realize how absurd it is to organize the logistics of importing 5,000 exotic animals just so you can stab them. And because Romans loved novelty, they staged bizarre matchups. Imagine a bear fighting a pack of dogs, or a rhinoceros fighting an elephant. It's like someone looked at the natural world and said, what if we made all the animals hate each other? The giraffe incident. One of the more famous spectacles involved a giraffe. The first giraffe ever brought to Rome arrived under Julius Caesar, and naturally, they threw it into the arena. Romans had no idea what it was. Some thought it was a camel-leopard hybrid, hence the name Camel leopardalis. The poor giraffe didn't stand a chance. A lion was released, the giraffe panicked, and, well, you can guess the rest. The audience probably gasped in delight, because nothing says cultural superiority than inventing animal cruelty as a party trick. Staging the spectacle. What's wild is just how choreographed these shows were. Gladiator matches weren't random chaos. They were carefully arranged, sometimes even scripted. There were warm-up acts like mock duels or comic skits, then the beast hunts, then the gladiators. Sometimes the games lasted all day, from sunrise to sunset. Picture sitting in a hot, noisy stadium for 12 hours, watching men in fish helmets try to stab each other with tridents. And people loved it. They cheered, they gambled, they gossiped. It wasn't just about the fights. It was about being part of the crowd, about proving you were Roman, and about joining the spectacle. The Colosseum was Rome's social media feed, just with more lions. Public opinion. Why did they love it? Here's the question modern people always ask. How could Romans enjoy this? Watching people and animals die for fun seems horrifying. But to Romans, it wasn't just entertainment. It was ideology. The games showed power, Rome's power, over life and death, over people and nature. It reminded the crowd of who was in charge, who owned the empire, and who could casually order 100 gladiators to fight for no reason. Plus, the games gave ordinary Romans a sense of control. They could cheer, boo, demand mercy, or demand death. For once, the people had a voice, even if it was only about whether some poor guy lived or died. So yes, the games were cruel, but they were also political theater, psychological release, and, let's be honest, an excuse to drink wine in the sun while yelling at strangers. And here's the thing, for all their cruelty, the Romans also saw gladiators as symbols of bravery, endurance, and discipline. Philosophers sometimes wrote about how gladiators showed the proper way to face death, calmly, bravely, without fear. So the same society that threw men into the sand for sport also held them up as moral examples, which is peak Roman logic. Like, we despise you, but also, please teach us how to die heroically. It's like if modern society treated reality TV contestants as spiritual guides. Which, actually, let's not give any ideas. And that's part 3. We floated through myths, the thumb confusion, exotic animal carnivals, and the weird cultural obsession Romans had with turning death into a teachable moment. Next time, we'll keep drifting into the aftermath, what happened to gladiators after retirement, how their legacy lived on in art and legend, and how this whole bloody system quietly shaped Europe long after the Colosseum fell silent. For now, let your mind picture a giraffe being very confused in a Roman arena, and let that gentle absurdity carry you into dreamland. Part 4. Retirement, Aftermath, and the Legacy of Gladiators. Welcome back, or maybe you're only half aware of this part. Either way, no rush. We're moving gently into the quieter, less blood-soaked chapters of the gladiator story. The part where they survive, retire, or fade into history. And the empire keeps pretending everything is normal while the Colosseum slowly empties. By now, we've covered their rise, the celebrity culture, emperors acting like WWE stars, and Romans importing exotic animals like it was an Olympic sport. But life doesn't end in the arena, and neither did the stories of these men and women. When gladiators survived. Yes, some gladiators actually survived. Shockingly, a few even retired voluntarily. Retirement was rare, but it happened. When a gladiator completed enough fights or was awarded enough victories, he might receive a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Now, here's where it gets ironic. Some gladiators who received the rudis chose to stay in the schools. Why? Fame, comfort, predictable meals, or maybe just inertia. After years of training and fighting, the idea of farming cabbage or joining a mundane family business probably sounded like psychological torture. So even when offered freedom, many gladiators clung to their dangerous, sweaty lifestyle. Imagine finishing a decade at a brutal tech company, finally being offered a quiet office job, and saying, "Nah, I'll stay here wrestling bears for a living, thanks." That was their version of life choices. Gladiator retirement. Slightly better life. For the few who did retire, life could be pleasant, or at least better than constant stabbing. Some became trainers at gladiator schools. They used their fame to negotiate better living conditions, and sometimes, incredibly rarely, they even married. Archaeological evidence shows tombstones of retired gladiators, many boasting of victories, fame, and the number of battles survived. Here lies Marcus, who fought bravely, killed lions, and survived 20 matches. Imagine putting that on your LinkedIn profile. It's a very look at me, I risked my life for a paycheck vibe. Still, society never fully accepted them. A retired gladiator could walk around free, but there was always a subtle stigma. Wealth and fame could smooth the edges, but for most, they were remembered as men who literally fought for the amusement of others, and that never entirely disappeared. The decline of gladiator games. By the 4th and 5th century CE, the Roman Empire was struggling. Christianity was spreading, emperors were broke or busy dealing with invasions. And honestly, the public was tired. Not tired like, I'll skip the Colosseum today, but tired like maybe watching people and animals die for fun isn't sustainable anymore. The games dwindled. Fewer exotic animals, fewer matches, less spectacle. Gladiators who survived had fewer chances to earn fame, and Ludi gradually closed. The Colosseum eventually became more of a monument than an active arena. And yet, the cultural memory lingered. Gladiators became symbols of bravery and endurance. They appeared in art, in stories, and even in moral lessons. Society had moved on, but the idea of the gladiator, stoic, skilled, tragic, sometimes ridiculous, never fully disappeared. Gladiators in memory and myth. Let's float into how gladiators lived on long after the last battle. They appeared in mosaics, frescoes, and inscriptions, celebrated for their skill, endurance, and virtue. In some ways, their stories became sanitized, less about survival and fame, more about morality. They were the perfect cautionary tale. Look, live bravely, fight skillfully, but remember, society might still see you as a spectacle. During the Renaissance and later periods, fascination with Rome's arenas resurfaced. Scholars and artists obsessed over gladiator imagery. Paintings depicted heroic fights, often ignoring the brutal reality. Hollywood centuries later picked up these sanitized versions and ran with them, which explains why everyone still thinks gladiators were constantly killing each other, all while dramatically staring into the sun. The quiet absurdity. If you think about it while lying in bed, is the quiet absurdity of it all. Men trained rigorously to fight and survive, while knowing their fame depended on risk. Emperors staged spectacles to impress the public, while pretending it was morally sound. The crowd cheered, booed, and placed bets, while occasionally worrying if the next gladiator might be their neighbor's cousin. Exotic animals were imported, sometimes just to be killed, because novelty was more important than logistics. It's a society obsessed with death, spectacle, and social hierarchy, but it somehow still managed to produce humor, art, and lasting legends. And isn't that just like history? Tragic, absurd, slightly horrifying, yet weirdly fascinating in a calm, sleepy way. Lessons from the arena. So what can we take away as we drift toward sleep? A few thoughts. Not everything is as heroic as it looks. Those buff guys in helmets, mostly slaves or desperate volunteers. Fame was real, but it came with constant risk. Society is complicated. The Romans loved gladiators and despised them at the same time. Celebrity culture isn't new. It just used more nets and lions back then. Absurdity is timeless. Exotic animals, ridiculous helmets, staged fights, emperors pretending to be warriors. It all seems over the top now, but it was the Roman version of daily life. Legacy matters. Even after the Colosseum fell silent, the memory of the gladiator persisted. Brave, skilled, sometimes foolish, but unforgettable. So, as you lie under your blanket, imagine the quiet chaos of Rome's arenas. Not the roaring violence, but the strange, slightly ridiculous rhythm of life that turned suffering into spectacle, danger into entertainment, and ordinary people into legends. And that's part 4. We've drifted from retirement to legacy to reflection on society's quirks. The story of gladiators ends not with a dramatic death, but with subtle echoes, monuments, mosaics, and the faint hum of history reminding us of a world obsessed with risk, honor, and spectacle. Next time, we can gently wrap up with a final reflection on the cultural impact of gladiators, lingering myths in modern media, and the strange lessons their lives still offer us today. Part 5. Cultural Impact and Modern Echoes. Welcome back. Or maybe you're barely listening now, and that's okay. This is the gentle final stretch of our long, meandering journey through the dusty sands of Rome's gladiatorial arenas. We've met the fighters, emperors, and exotic animals. We've laughed a little, quietly, at the absurdity. And now it's time to see how their legacy echoes across centuries, all the way to modern times. From arenas to art. Even after the Colosseum emptied, gladiators refused to vanish from memory. They appeared in mosaics, frescoes, and inscriptions. artists loved the idea of a man fighting valiantly, helmeted and sweaty, while a crowd cheered or gasped in the background. During the Renaissance, European painters, fascinated by classical Rome, frequently depicted gladiators. The fights were often sanitized, heroic, and dramatic, usually ignoring the messy reality of tridents, nets, and chained lions. In these works, gladiators became symbols of bravery, endurance, and nobility, because, apparently, medieval and Renaissance society preferred their history served as inspiration rather than a warning. Even today, you see echoes of this in movies, TV shows, and video games. Gladiators are usually buff, tragic heroes, fighting for honor and freedom, often staring dramatically into the sunlight. They're heroic archetypes, stripped of the mundane, repetitive, and often absurd details of their real lives. Gladiators in literature. The fascination with gladiators didn't stop at visual art. Writers, poets, and historians chronicled their feats, sometimes accurately, often romantically. Ancient sources like Seneca described gladiators as moral examples of endurance and courage. Later historians turned their lives into cautionary tales or moral allegories. Even Shakespeare-adjacent writers and Victorian historians loved weaving gladiatorial imagery into stories about human struggle, power, and spectacle. And in each retelling, the details that made gladiators ordinary, like barley diets, staged fights, and ridiculously designed helmets, were conveniently minimized. Modern gladiators. Echoes in sports and culture. If you squint, gladiators never really disappeared. Their spirit lives on in professional sports. The carefully choreographed violence, celebrity culture, and fan obsession we see today has an uncanny resemblance to Rome's arenas. Football, wrestling, MMA, and boxing all share aspects of the gladiatorial experience. Athletes are admired, but sometimes despised. Fans cheer, boo, and bet. Fame comes with physical risk, career uncertainty, and public scrutiny. Gladiators weren't the first sports stars, but they were certainly the loudest, sweatiest, and bloodiest prototype. In some ways, the Colosseum was history's first stadium for mass entertainment, complete with marketing, VIP sections, and merchandise. Okay, maybe not souvenir t-shirts, but you get the idea. Lessons for modern minds. So, as we float toward the end of this long, gentle narration, let's reflect. History is messy. Gladiators were more complicated than movies let on. Famous yet marginalized, respected yet despised, feared yet admired. Spectacle is timeless. Humans have always been drawn to drama, danger, and skill. The mediums may change, sand arenas, stadiums, video streams, but the fascination persists. Celebrity comes at a cost. Fame in Rome meant glory, but also constant danger. The same is true today in different forms. Absurdity is part of life. Romans imported lions, staged giraffe fights, and had emperors cosplaying as warriors. History is often stranger than fiction, and that strangeness persists. And maybe that's the gentle takeaway. Gladiators were tragic, absurd, heroic, and ridiculous at all times. They lived extraordinary lives, not necessarily by choice, but by circumstance. They entertained, survived, and became legends. And even as the Colosseum crumbled, their memory remained, whispering through mosaics, inscriptions, literature, and modern culture. A final thought. So as your eyelids get heavier, picture this. A retired gladiator, maybe Flamma or Spiculus, sitting quietly under the Mediterranean sun. No cheering crowd, no lions, no absurd helmet, just calm. A barley meal, maybe a wooden sword on the ground, a reminder of what once was. And somewhere in the distance, the echoes of the Colosseum persist. The cheers, the gasps, the absurdity, the spectacle. They are gone but not forgotten. History is a lullaby of strange people, strange ideas, and slightly ridiculous obsessions. And the gladiators, they are the perfect example. Ordinary humans turned into heroes, celebrities, and legends, all while slightly confused about why anyone cared so much in the first place. So drift off. Let the sound of Roman crowds fade. Imagine nets, tridents, fish helmets, and maybe a very confused giraffe. And sleep knowing that the absurdity of history is in some ways a very comforting constant. Part 6. Odd Stories, Rituals, and Quirks of Gladiators. Welcome back, or maybe you're only half listening as your mind drifts. Either way, we're going to float gently into some of the stranger, more absurd, and slightly tragic details of gladiatorial life. The bits that aren't in your standard history textbook or Hollywood blockbuster. Because, as you may have noticed, Rome was obsessed not only with skill and bravery, but also with spectacle, ritual, and just plain weirdness. The gladiator diet, barley and ash. We mentioned the barley men before, but let's linger a bit longer on their diets. Gladiators ate mostly barley, beans, and occasionally meat. That's right. If you imagine gladiators as protein shake, beefsteak types, think again. Barley was their mainstay. Interestingly, studies of skeletal remains show they also drank a tonic of ashes and vinegar. Why? Because Romans believed it strengthened bones. Imagine a protein shake made of burnt wood and sour wine. Somehow it worked, or at least it didn't kill them immediately. The diet was dull, repetitive, and probably hard to enjoy, but it kept them alive long enough to fight in dozens of matches, because a starving gladiator is not exactly good for business. Gladiatorial tattoos and branding. Many gladiators were tattooed or branded with marks indicating their school, victories, or status. It was part of the image. A gladiator's body was a living record of service, danger, and loyalty. Or, depending on the mark, shame. The irony, of course, is that these tattoos were sometimes permanent reminders of a life that few chose voluntarily. A retired gladiator might leave the arena free, rich, or famous, but still carry marks of a past that society remembered, and sometimes mocked. Odd rituals and pre-fight superstitions. Before stepping into the arena, gladiators often engaged in peculiar rituals. Some would touch the statues of gods for protection. Others would make offerings to spirits or whisper prayers to invisible patrons of luck. One ritual involved touching the helmet or trident 3 times because, obviously, a random sequence of gestures could magically prevent being stabbed. It's a subtle reminder that even the most hardened warriors had superstitions, quirks, and tiny habits designed to comfort themselves before facing danger. Gladiators and fans. The ancient paparazzi. Fans were intense. Sometimes women or men would follow gladiators around, giving gifts, writing graffiti, or shouting advice during fights. The level of obsession could be extreme. One graffiti from Pompeii reads, "I love Flamma, marry me," which is touching, except Flamma couldn't marry her, fight a lion, and survive at the same time. This fandom also fueled gossip, rivalries, and sometimes even blackmail. A gladiator could gain social power, but it came with social obligations, and occasionally very awkward attention from wealthy admirers. Injuries, healing, and the business of pain. Gladiators were expensive, so they didn't die casually. Trainers, doctors, and support staff did everything possible to keep them alive. Broken bones were reset, wounds treated, and infections avoided where possible. The medical care could be surprisingly sophisticated. Roman doctors knew which herbs helped wounds, which plasters prevented infection, and even used techniques reminiscent of modern physical therapy. So, in a strange way, gladiators benefited from advanced care, at least relative to ordinary citizens or farm slaves. And yet, they still fought repeatedly, knowing each match carried the risk of death. A calculated risk, not reckless, but terrifying all the same. Gladiators in festivals and pageantry. Gladiators didn't only fight in the Colosseum. They often appeared in parades, religious festivals, and ceremonial displays. Sometimes they were dressed as mythological heroes, gods, or legendary warriors, performing choreographed fights for the amusement of the crowd. These staged appearances blurred the line between theater and combat. Some gladiators became professional performers, acting out mythic battles rather than simply fighting for survival. And in these moments, the absurdity is clear. Men trained to kill were also expected to perform like actors in a ridiculous costume for the sake of public entertainment. The emotional toll. It's worth pausing here, quietly, to consider the human side. Gladiators weren't merely athletes or entertainers, they were people. Some were terrified, some were stoic, and some undoubtedly grew to love the attention. We have records of personal letters, graffiti, and inscriptions that hint at fear, longing, and grief. A gladiator might write, "I fight, I bleed, but I hope tomorrow I survive." The arena was entertainment for the public, but for the fighters themselves, it was anxiety, routine, and sometimes fleeting triumph. Even in their absurd glory, they were living under constant pressure. Fame and adoration didn't erase the daily danger or the reality that the crowd could turn against them in a heartbeat. The last gasp of gladiatorial culture. By the late Empire, gladiatorial culture was fading. Christianity condemned the games, finances couldn't sustain massive spectacles, and public interest waned. The Colosseum became quiet. The exotic animals disappeared. The barley men either retired, died, or faded into history. And yet, their memory persisted. Stories of bravery, spectacle, and absurdity were written down, copied, and retold. Even centuries later, people were fascinated. Somehow, the image of a man in armor, fighting under the sun while crowds roared, remained compelling. It's a testament to the strange power of history. What seems cruel, absurd, or trivial in its own time can become legendary centuries later. And that's part 6. We floated through quirky rituals, diets, tattoos, fan obsession, medical care, and the emotional side of gladiators' lives. Slowly, the world of the arena reveals itself not just as spectacle, but as a complex human story, tragic, absurd, and oddly relatable. Next time, we can wrap up with a gentle final reflection on the entire gladiator era, tying together legacy, modern echoes, and the human stories that survived through history. Part 7. Final Reflection and Sleepy Conclusion. Welcome back. Or maybe you're barely keeping your eyes open. That's okay. This is the final stretch, the slow drift toward the end of our long, meandering journey through Rome's arenas, gladiators' lives, and the strange echoes of their world. We've covered the rise of gladiators, their celebrity culture, emperors acting like overgrown action stars, exotic animals, odd rituals, retirement, and legacy. Now it's time to gently tie it all together. The humanity of gladiators. Let's pause for a moment to consider the people behind the helmets and tridents. Gladiators were human, not myth. They felt fear, pride, longing, and exhaustion. They experienced triumphs and failures, survived fights, got injured, and sometimes fell in love, or at least were adored by many admirers. The absurdity of their lives, fighting lions, performing for emperors, wearing ridiculous armor, coexisted with very real human struggles. Some survived dozens of battles, only to retire quietly. Others died in the arena, remembered only by graffiti or the faint echo of a crowd's cheer. And yet, in the end, they were immortalized. Their stories persisted, quietly shaping our idea of heroism, spectacle, and celebrity. The legacy in modern culture. Gladiators live on today, not just in movies and games, but in the structure of human fascination with spectacle. Sports, reality TV, professional combat, all echo the same basic dynamics. Skill, risk, and endurance are admired. Fans cheer, critique, and obsess. Fame comes with public scrutiny and pressure. In a way, every modern athlete, stunt performer, or entertainer carries a tiny fragment of the gladiator legacy. And maybe that's comforting. History isn't only about wars and kings. It's about ordinary humans navigating absurd circumstances, sometimes surviving, sometimes thriving, sometimes leaving a legacy. The absurd beauty of history. The gladiator world was strange, dangerous, and often ridiculous. Giraffes in the arena, emperors cosplaying as warriors, barley diets, staged fights, and obsessive fans. And yet, within that absurdity lies a strange beauty, human resilience, creativity, and the desire to be remembered. History often feels distant, abstract, or boring, but when you slow down, when you imagine a tired gladiator brushing sand off his shoulders, a lion roaring in the distance, a cheering crowd fading into memory, you see the rhythm of human life, fascination, and absurdity repeating across centuries. A gentle goodbye. So, as you drift further towards sleep, picture the final scene, a quiet Colosseum at dusk. The crowds have gone. Lions sleep. Helmets and tridents are stacked neatly in the corner. A retired gladiator sits under the Mediterranean sun, quietly enjoying a barley meal. The arena is silent, but the echoes of human courage, absurdity, and fascination linger. Gladiators live on, not in spectacle or blood, but in memory, stories, and the gentle hum of history that continues to intrigue, amuse, and sometimes soothe us. And that, my friends, is the slow, sleepy story of Roman gladiators. So, let your mind wander among the sand, the helmet, the net, and occasional confused giraffe. Drift off, knowing that history is often absurd, sometimes tragic, and always fascinating enough to lull you gently into sleep. Part 8. Minor Gladiators, Forgotten Stories, and Everyday Arena Life. Welcome back, or maybe you're already half asleep, which is perfect because this part is slow, gentle, and full of small, almost mundane stories that history usually ignores. Today, we float over the lives of lesser-known gladiators, behind-the-scenes details, and the everyday rhythm of arena life. The unsung gladiators. We've talked about famous names like Flama and Spiculus, but most gladiators were ordinary men, or occasionally women, whose names are lost to history. They didn't achieve fame, but they still lived extraordinary lives. These gladiators trained, ate, fought, and survived with little recognition. Some may have hoped for victory or freedom, others simply followed orders. Their lives were repetitive, dangerous, and occasionally absurd, like a daily commute that could end with a lion. It's worth imagining a day in their life. Wake up before sunrise, eat barley porridge, train in the arena, survive a fight, nurse injuries, gossip with fellow fighters, repeat. Not glamorous, not heroic, just life with tridents. Women in the arena. Yes, there were female gladiators, though far fewer than men. They were called gladiatrices, and their stories are even more obscure. Sometimes they fought for novelty, spectacle, or imperial whim. Archaeological evidence shows tombstones and reliefs commemorating women fighters. Like men, they could achieve fame, suffer injury, or retire quietly. And, like men, their lives were often absurd, publicly admired, privately endangered, and occasionally treated like exotic curiosities by spectators. Imagine a woman gladiator navigating social expectations, imperial whims, and daily training, all while occasionally staring down a lion, and then trying to explain that life to your neighbors afterward. Daily life around the arena. Life around the arena wasn't all fighting. Schools or ludi had cooks, trainers, doctors, and administrators. Gladiators needed sleep, food, exercise, and medical care. They were part of a small, highly organized community. There were even morning drills and stretching routines. Think of it as a gym, school, and workplace all in one, but with a higher risk of death. And yes, gossip, friendship, and occasional petty rivalries existed just like any workplace. Even minor disputes could escalate into staged fights, sometimes as part of training, sometimes as spectacle. And fans occasionally followed gladiators outside the arena, cheering or offering bribes. So their world wasn't just violent, it was socially complicated. Gladiator superstitions and rituals. Gladiators were surprisingly superstitious. They carried charms, whispered prayers, and touched statues before fights. Some had lucky helmets, favorite weapons, or specific warm-up routines. A bestiaris, for example, might whisper to a lion before a fight, probably hoping the lion didn't take it personally. Others had very precise pre-fight eating rituals or gestures, because if there's one thing humans love, it's thinking a pattern can control fate. These superstitions gave structure and comfort to a life that was otherwise unpredictable, dangerous, and absurdly public. Behind-the-scenes humor. Not everything was solemn. Gladiators had their own humor, Dry and ironic, often whispered quietly while trainers weren't watching. They mocked each other's helmets, joked about odd injuries, or grumbled about the emperor's absurd costume choices. Humor became a coping mechanism because when your life is literally a public spectacle of danger, a little sarcasm goes a long way. Imagine a gladiator muttering, "Oh, sure, let's fight the rhino today. Why not?" It's quiet humor, the kind that survives only in imagination and faint graffiti. Everyday absurdities. Some small absurdities. Gladiators had fan clubs, but sometimes fans got overly intense. Graffiti begged for kisses, marriage proposals, or promised eternal devotion. Equipment malfunctions happened. Helmets too small, sandals slippery, swords bent. It all had to be managed, sometimes mid-fight. Gladiators occasionally staged mock duels just to practice, which sometimes looked ridiculously dramatic to outsiders. These tiny details remind us that gladiators were not just heroes or victims, they were humans navigating a world that combined danger, absurdity, and public scrutiny in a way no modern profession truly matches. Reflections on forgotten lives. Most gladiators' names are lost. Most fights are unrecorded. Most fans have disappeared into the dust of history. Yet their collective life shapes our understanding of ancient Rome. The obsession with spectacle, power, risk, and admiration. It's comforting in a strange way to think of these minor gladiators. They didn't achieve fame, but they endured, laughed quietly, and survived the absurdity as best they could. And in doing so, they became part of the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of history. Part 9. Regional schools, local customs, and obscure anecdotes. Welcome back. Or maybe your eyes are already halfway closed. Perfect. Today we drift through the quieter corners of gladiator life. Regional variations in schools, local customs, and the smaller, often forgotten stories that don't make the big history books. Because, as you've probably noticed, the world of gladiators wasn't uniform. Rome was vast, and the way people trained, fought, and celebrated them varied by location. Regional differences in gladiator schools. Gladiator schools, or ludus, were spread across the empire, and each had its own style. Capua was famous for producing heavy infantry-type fighters. Their training emphasized brute strength and endurance. Rome itself had the most prestigious schools, often funded by emperors or wealthy sponsors, with rigorous routines and a focus on public spectacle. Southern Gaul and Hispania produced lighter, more agile fighters, perfect for novelty matchups or crowd-pleasing duels. These differences shaped not only fighting style, but also personality, camaraderie, and even diet. Imagine two gladiators from different schools meeting in the arena. One trained to overpower, the other to dodge elegantly. The contrast must have looked strangely choreographed to the audience. Local customs and rituals. Each region also had its quirks. In some provinces, gladiators were expected to perform ritual dances before fights. In others, festivals combined gladiatorial contests with local religious ceremonies. Sometimes the rules differed. In a small provincial arena, a fight might end with mock submission rather than death, especially if local magistrates didn't want too many casualties. Meanwhile, in Rome proper, the crowd demanded spectacle and sometimes extreme danger. Even funerary practices varied. Some regions commemorated fallen gladiators with tombstones, others with simple altars or mosaics. The way each community remembered them reflected local values and social structure. Obscure anecdotes. Now, for some minor, slightly absurd historical anecdotes. A gladiator in the East was recorded as refusing to fight until he received a proper meal. Romans apparently obliged, probably because hunger is stronger motivator than fame. Some provincial arenas staged mock naval battles in flooded arenas. Gladiators became temporary sailors, paddling tiny boats while fighting, because why not combine water, weapons, and potential drowning into a public spectacle? In certain North African provinces, exotic animals were substituted with regional fauna. Ostriches, gazelles, and even hyenas occasionally faced the fighters. Imagine stepping into a fight and realizing your opponent is a very confused ostrich. These small details add texture. Life as a gladiator was perilous, yes, but it was also absurd, unpredictable, and occasionally humorous. Training variations. Training differed depending on climate, diet, and local custom. In warmer provinces, gladiators trained earlier to avoid the sun, often in smaller, sand-filled arenas. In cooler regions, the pace was slower, with more emphasis on technique than brute force. Some schools incorporated mock battles with wooden swords or padded armor to reduce injury. Others embraced full contact sparring from day one, relying on toughness, quick reflexes, and sheer luck. Imagine visiting a provincial school. The smell of sand, sweat, and barley porridge mingling, gladiators sparring quietly, a trainer muttering complaints about a bent helmet, a lion pacing in a nearby pen. It was chaotic, routine, and strangely structured, all at once. The small, forgotten stories. Many gladiators never made it into history books. They weren't famous, didn't die heroically, and weren't commemorated by wealthy patrons. Yet their lives mattered in small ways. The gladiator who secretly helped another avoid a dangerous match. The trainer who improvised an herbal remedy to save an injured fighter. The provincial magistrate who organized a festival but improvised rules to keep more gladiators alive. These small actions, barely recorded, ripple through time in faint graffiti, minor inscriptions, or archaeological traces. They remind us that history is full of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Reflections. As we drift slowly through this part, it's worth noting that the empire wasn't uniform. Life as a gladiator depended on geography, local culture, luck, and the whims of those in power. And yet, despite the differences, the essence remained: skill, endurance, risk, and a faintly absurd spectacle that captivated audiences everywhere. Part 10. Philosophical and Moral Reflections of Gladiators. Welcome back, or perhaps you're only half listening, drifting between thoughts and the rhythm of this slow story. Either way, this part is quieter, contemplative, and full of subtle reflections. Today, we look at how ancient thinkers, writers, and philosophers interpreted the lives of gladiators, and what that might mean for us centuries later. Philosophers on the arena. Some Roman philosophers had mixed feelings about gladiators. Stoics, for example, found the spectacle morally troubling, but also intellectually fascinating. Seneca, one of the most famous Stoics, wrote about the bravery and endurance of gladiators while quietly criticizing the cruelty of the games. He acknowledged their skill and courage. They are brave because they must be, but also questioned society. Why admire danger for entertainment? Why celebrate blood as sport? These reflections are gentle critiques, not fiery condemnations. The Stoics were calm, rational, and slightly sarcastic, much like our narrative style here. The moral dilemma. Gladiators embodied a constant tension in Roman society. They were admired for courage, skill, and endurance, but marginalized as slaves or social outcasts. Society simultaneously celebrated and condemned them. This moral contradiction fascinated writers and thinkers. Pliny the Elder, for example, noted their physical excellence and public admiration, but also remarked on the absurdity of risking life purely for spectacle. And historians today continue to reflect on this tension: fascination versus exploitation, admiration versus pity, glory versus absurdity. Life as a mirror. Some philosophers saw the arena as a mirror of life itself. Danger, effort, chance, and social pressures all collided in one space. Gladiators were extreme examples of universal truths. Everyone faces risk. Everyone seeks recognition. Everyone navigates absurd systems of power and expectation. In a strange way, watching a fight in the Colosseum wasn't only entertainment. It was a subtle philosophical lesson. Humans, stripped to skill, courage, and circumstance, were revealed in their rawest form. Sometimes noble, sometimes ridiculous. Death, glory, and human nature. Philosophical reflections also focused on mortality. Gladiators faced death daily, and yet life went on. Their fame and victories were fleeting. The applause faded, and tombstones or graffiti were all that remained. It's a quiet lesson about human nature. Glory is temporary. Courage is subjective, and absurdity is constant. And perhaps that's why the story of gladiators continues to resonate. It reminds us of our own small daily battles, often mundane, sometimes absurd, and occasionally heroic in subtle ways. Modern reflections. Fast forward to today, the moral reflections of ancient philosophers still resonate. Modern sports, celebrity culture, and even professional risk-takers echo the same tension. We admire skill and courage, yet quietly wonder if society is exploiting the participants. Watching a modern athlete, actor, or performer, you might notice parallels: fame, skill, endurance, and subtle absurdity. The philosophical questions linger. What are we really celebrating? How much risk is worth admiration? And how often do we miss the quiet humanity behind the spectacle? Quiet lessons for today. So as you drift deeper into sleep, consider these gentle takeaways. Bravery is contextual. Gladiators were brave because they had to be, not always because they wanted to be. Context shapes courage. Society creates absurd spectacles. From Rome to modern media, fascination with risk, skill, and danger is a constant. Life is fleeting, yet memorable. Gladiators' lives were short, sometimes tragic, but remembered through stories, inscriptions, and echoes of culture. Humanity persists amid absurdity. Humor, friendship, superstition, and subtle resistance flourished even in extreme conditions. The gladiators' world may seem distant, brutal, or ridiculous, but in reflection, it mirrors our own. Risk, social judgment, admiration, and subtle absurdity woven together into the fabric of daily life. A gentle farewell. Picture a quiet arena at dusk. Philosophers might be scribbling, gladiators resting, and the crowd long gone. The sand, the helmets, the wooden swords, all are silent, yet full of stories, reflections, and subtle lessons. History, like sleep, teaches patience, observation, and contemplation. Gladiators fought, survived, laughed quietly, and sometimes fell. And centuries later, we can still float through their world, absurd, human, slightly tragic, and gently instructive. So as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the echo of the Colosseum fading into night. Let the quiet absurdity, the courage, and the odd beauty of gladiator life lull you gently into rest.